Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, the host of Eating at a Meeting podcast, which you're here to listen to, as well as Thrive Meetings and Events, a consulting firm on safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage. And I am here to talk to this guy, Alan Kleinfeld. His background is a meeting planner, as well as mine. He's been in the industry for over 20 years, having organized conferences and events from soup to nuts. He also has 20 years in public safety, serving as a reserve police officer for over 20 years. So you did those two together. I did. Or you're that, because you're that young, right?
Young. No, it was done at the same time. The police volunteer thing was that. It was volunteer, so I did it on my own time.
Wow. Okay. And the reason I wanted to talk to Alan for everybody to know is that I've been seeing a lot on LinkedIn and in the news and on Twitter about emergency medical kits that are on airplanes, and they're not being stocked with some of the necessary medications that they are supposed to have. And it's a long conversation. I'll share some links with you on that. But I wanted to talk to Alan with his public safety background on what we as planners need to know about event safety, especially as it relates to food and beverage. So, Alan, what should planners be considering about event safety when they're planning their meetings?
Sure. So that's almost a loaded question because safety is such a large umbrella, and there's so many different elements of it. You've got your physical safety, the space you're going to use. You have your tech safety to make sure that your attendees or your membership data is secure. You've got your environmental data and environmental security, which might be climate change related, like physical, geographical, or it could be political environment. You've got all these different things. So the one thing I like to tell planners who are going to get serious about considering safety at their events is to start slow, start with one or two little things, and start from that. Something like when you do a site visit and you're looking at the meeting space and you're deciding that this meeting room is very functional and I could get so many different classroom setups in here and whatnot, that you might look and just make sure that there are lighted emergency exits, so you can say, click, I got that on my checkoff list. The other thing about safety is you don't need to do it by yourself. You can delegate different elements of your safety plan to different members of your staff, or maybe different members of your conference planning committee, or so a third party outsource something resource. There are avenues out there to help with that. But the one thing I'll say is don't not include safety in your planning.
Well, I was watching something on the Today Show. All the safety plans that schools are doing now for safety for the kids with active shooting. And unfortunately, I watched a little mom teaching her kid before he went to kindergarten what to do.
The Spider-Man backpack.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we didn't do that when we were little kids, right? That wasn't part of our lives.
Yeah.
First and foremost, what's the first thing that they should consider? And should we have somebody on site all the time?
So when it comes to the way people become violent or do stuff, the story you just mentioned about the little kid going through that training, mm-hmm. I sometimes think often how much of that we need to do in our industry, if at all. And the question kind of is, a lot of people hold conferences or meetings or events either to make money or bring in some kind of revenue or do some kind of promotion. And so safety isn't really part of that thought process. And sometimes it's a debate or a pro and con, a balance between how much safety do I need to put into this thing, considering that there are no identifiable threats. You
Right.
saw where someone Rushdie got knifed on stage, right? And now people are talking about at our events, what kind of security do we have to have for our stages? It's really hard to say, because who knew that guy was going to jump out on that stage and do that? Now, if this is a complete just made up example, so no one should take this too seriously. But if you're planning your meeting and a couple of days out, one of your employees snaps and says, "I'm going to get you," that could be a sign that something violent might happen at your event. But failing that, it's so hard to predict what humans are going to do to other humans in a large group setting. So, when it comes to that, my basic advice to meeting planners is you need to work with your venue and your other partners and just make sure that there is a general overall sense of safety. Most hotels will have cameras someplace and security staff someplace that may not even look like security staff. They may have areas that are not accessible except to security staff. So when you go on site and you say, "Hey, we're going to be doing this kind of event here, and we're going to have speakers and whatnot," how safe is this venue? And do I need to have extra security or protection on the stage, a clear screen or something like that? Because if there's no sign that it's going to happen, chances are it may not happen.
Right. And then I think it's also important to watch their social media feeds, because that guy somebody had put a mark on his head. But
Exactly.
But even the political guy that guy jumped on the stage and the Republican somewhere with that thing in his hand and was going to stab him in the neck. Like, hello.
Yeah.
But you're right.
Surprised, that guy, Rushdie, had been, he had a long history of it, and maybe he figured he doesn't need his protection anymore. If I had been working with a group and there was that kind of history, I might suggest, hey, you might want a couple of security guys in the wings of that stage, or maybe put the presenter behind a screen or something. But I don't know if there were those kinds of indications. Definitely take steps. I would definitely recommend taking steps to prevent it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And okay, so how do we reduce the burden of safety? And I mean, we want to reduce the burden of your liability burden, right? How do you reduce the burden? Say, what are things that meeting planners can do to reduce the burden?
Sure. So a couple of things and again, it's just not the meeting planner by him or her or their selves. This is, when you do your hotel RFP, you can include what kind of safety expectations you want, or lay down the foundation to at least say, hey, moving forward, I need to talk about safety, and here's why. So you can start with the RFP. When you go to contract, and I won't tell you what kind of clauses and whatnot, I'm not a lawyer to do that kind of stuff, but you can put things in contracts that help protect you, your attendees, your stakeholders. So you can even include it there. And I know after COVID, people were trying to put in, hey, if another pandemic happens, we can cancel this meeting. I don't know how all that's going to work, but you can include safety as part of that contract phase. And then when it comes to when you're physically working with your sites and your suppliers and your venues, everyone needs to be on the same page safety wise. So you don't want your venue doing one thing, your AV company doing another thing, because if they happen to contradict each other, there could be some kind of safety element there that's being overlooked. And so it needs to be a looped in conversation where the communication is going back and forth. And that's going to be a big part of the planner, the suppliers, and the attendees all being protected by some increased sense of safety, even if it is just for liability's sake.
Well, and that's just, it's asking lots of questions. Even with EMTs, right? And emergency medical stuff is like asking the questions, who's available to be here? Who do you have on site? What is their capabilities? And that jumps me to like kind of that medicine, right?
Yeah.
With epinephrine.
Yeah. So, and it's funny that you mentioned, we were just talking about liability, because I think things have changed for a long time. When I was, in my early planning stages and I was going on site, I had my box that had everything I could think of that I would need. So I had duct tape and scissors and screwdrivers and flashlights and glow sticks and a first aid kit. Well, now I'm like, first aid kit, liability, possibly. So now, I advise when someone comes to the registration counter and says, I got a headache, do you have some Tylenol? I don't want to hand out any kind of medicine to someone, even if it's over the counter, because I don't know that person's medical history, what other drugs they're on or anything. Mm-hmm. So I move that liability and I simply say, I don't, regretfully, I don't have Tylenol here at the registration counter, but there's a pharmacy right around the corner. You can go buy your pharmacy, whatever. Right. Same thing with if someone says I'm cut and I need a Band-Aid, I will usually say, check with the hotel security or, and let them, because I don't want to, dealing with bloodborne pathogens and things like that. Let's move that liability away from the meeting planner altogether.
Okay.
And the same kind of thing with the defibrillators or with EpiPens. It's going to be a question between the meeting planner and the supplier or the venue, who wants to have that liability. If the hotel doesn't have a defibrillator, does that mean you're not going to plan your meeting there? Or does that mean you're going to buy your own defibrillator? Or are you going to rely on dialing 911 if you need it? So these are the process. There's no real clear answer. The meeting planners are going to have to do kind of a Q&A with themselves and find out what's going to work best for them, their group, their attendees, their stakeholders.
Going back to that defibrillator, and Tyra Warner and I have talked about this in our sessions, and she's your good friend as well. Mm-hmm. But
I love Tyra.
There's a duty of what is it in Europe? It's a duty of non-responsive, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you have a duty of care, and to me, for the epinephrine, places of public accommodation, 36 states actually allow places of public accommodation to stock epinephrine, just like they do defibrillators. Mm-hmm. I'm sure, I don't know how many people probably do it, probably not very many, mm-hmm. but somebody needs to be trained on how to use it. Mm-hmm. But to me, as a meeting, they do expire. Yep.
Put it in a drawer and leave it there for 5 years.
Right.
It may work perfectly well, but for liability issues, if it doesn't work, then you might have a problem. Right.
Yeah. Well, and I actually had a reaction to some food at an event in Florida a couple of years ago. And the hotel person, the catering person, called the safety officer for the hotel and brought him to me. And he's like, do you have an EpiPen? And I said, yeah. He's like, let me see it. And he checked the expiration dates on it. And I'm like, and it was still viable or whatever, but I ended up choosing Benadryl, which is not the right response. But I also had to get up and speak in 20 minutes. But that's the other thing too, is EMTs. Not all EMTs are allowed to carry or administer epinephrine. Do you know anything about that?
I'm guessing it's going to probably vary from state to state or municipality to municipality, and it probably has to do with, I'm guessing, liability issue that at some point an EMT went ahead and used an EpiPen and it either was expired or it had a bad reaction, and that person either died or became more ill, and someone said, hey, it was the EMT's fault for using that EpiPen, so we're going to go ahead and sue. And so in that municipality, they may just say, okay, we're not going to take that risk anymore. And that's what happens for dealing with that. You might argue one way or the other that there's a personal responsibility that you need to carry your own EpiPen. And then how much do you want to rely on 911 when you're having an incident?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a question that you actually have to call your EMTs and say, okay, who do you have it? Who's able to administer? If you have, I would want to know it in general, but I also, when you're asking your attendees saying, do you have your own epinephrine? If they say, hey, they have a food allergy, ask them, do they have their own epinephrine or EpiPen or Avacue or whatever brand that they have? Yep. And where do they store it? Yep. Right. You should be asking those questions.
From a meeting planner's perspective, when you're working with your venues and your attendees or whoever, you certainly have, I'm encouraging you to ask those questions as a general overall safety. Depending on the group I'm working with, sometimes I do ask, hey, does this hotel have a first aid kit? And does it include this, this, and this? And do they have a defibrillator? And if the answer is no, depending on the group, they may say, okay, well, we're going to bring our own because I don't want any of my attendees not to have that. And that meeting planner or that organization will take on that liability on themselves.
Right. Okay. I mean, it is really, I mean, whether or diabetic, right?
Yeah.
Insulin, right? And that's a question to ask your
Inhalers
EMTs.
for asthmatics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, those are the
Those
kind of
can all be triggered by food or not be triggered by food, right? Exactly.
right,
So understanding.
right.
And I think there's a form that I've created that is like in case of emergency for the people who say they have diabetes or they have, epinephrine, what do we do in case of an emergency for you? Right?
Yep.
Where's your medication? And
Yeah,
and you can hand that off to the EMT and then you're done.
you can.
Yeah.
It's funny you bring that up because I don't know. I call it ICE, in case emergency, ICE.
Mm-hmm.
So in my phone, you can turn on. I have an iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
and you can click on the little, whatever it is, 911.
Right.
I probably won't be able to bring it up right now, obviously. And then you can search my contacts for ICE, and it will bring up
Right.
2 people who know my medical history and exactly.
Oops, not there. Yeah, that ICE icon.
Yeah.
It's an app. Yeah.
Yeah. You can actually, the iPhone itself actually has its own built-in app.
That was it, I think. Wasn't
Okay,
it?
good.
I thought so. Yeah.
You can also put your emergency information there, your allergies to medication, food, whatever you need to in that place. And so it's important that people fill that stuff out and that someone on site, whether it's the planner, the hotel, another attendee, your spouse, whoever you're traveling with, knows something about it. And then you, like you said, if you have to call 911 and medical services show up, you can share that information with them as well.
Right, exactly. All right. So I do want to jump into Roseanne's question. And so I'm going to put it up here on the screen. I would like to know what's my liability as an independent planner for alcohol service. And just for everybody listening, Alan nor I are attorneys, so we need Tyra here to answer that question. But we do know some of the regulations about that. So
sure. And so I'm looking at this, that she is the independent planner and she's working for a client, and the client wants a reception with some bars and maybe some buffet tables and everyone's having a good time type of thing. I'm looking at it like that. And so my first question is going to be, what kind of contract do you have with your client? Because the ones I use, there's something in there that says I'm not an employee of this group. I'm not underneath any of their healthcare or insurances or any of that, and I am independent. And then I might have my own general liability insurance just in case or something like that. So that's one thing I'm going to say is check your agreement with the group, and then check the group, see what their insurance is, because they're probably going to have something in order to contract with the venue, so that the group doesn't have the liability. So there's that as well. Check and see what the contract is with the venue. And then if you're worried about alcohol or too much alcohol being a concern, you can work with your group or your venue and limit how much people will consume, or work with the venue to have someone on site who knows how to deal with people who've had too much to consume so they can be removed safely. And then there's also the fact that you can do things like, hey, if it gets a little out of hand, you close the bar, or you bring in more food and more water or more coffee. And there are ways to combat that so it doesn't get out of hand. The important thing is to be watching it so it doesn't get out of hand, and to communicate all your alcohol-related concerns before the drinking starts.
Right. And I think you can also not only checking your own contract, but also make sure you're added to their as an additional insured to their insurance and to the hotel's insurance, so that make sure that you are covered underneath that. I mean, I got thrown from a golf cart years ago, and the guy I was working with, neither of us had us add to the additional insured to that contract. So it was our own fault, right?
You had to take care of that on your own then.
Right. Exactly. So making sure that's another step. But I also think, Roseanne, is definitely asking the properties and the people who are serving the alcohol, do all the servers have tips training, or so that they have alcohol training so they know how to look for it? And one of my biggest things thinking about this too is if Alan is going, you've got 5 bars, Alan might be going to all 5 bars, and one bartender might not know that Alan's been to the other 4 bars and already had 4 drinks, right? So I don't know how you communicate with those bartenders, but it is definitely making sure that you've got somebody that's kind of tracking that. But
you could do it with, some people try it. Some planners use the ticket system,
right?
But that works. And that's not a bad way to do it. But those who don't drink or don't use all their tickets will just give those tickets out willy nilly. Right. So you could have 8 tickets within 8 minutes and you're ready to go. And the bartender know that. Right,
exactly. Or the sponsors of the event start handing out drink tickets. And so people definitely have more than 2. So it's definitely figuring out a way to track that so you can watch it, but also making sure that your bartenders have some sort of keen sense or training on how to
training for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's called Chip. I think those are good points.
Yeah. The other one too is making sure that you do have non-alcoholic beverages on site as well. Don't, even if you have beer and wine, make sure that you have some of the new cool fun drinks, not just water and soda,
what they call them, the mocktails. The
mocktails, exactly. Because, some people only want to have one drink, right? And they want to have something else after that. So make sure that you've got fun sodas or spritzers and things like that that are alcohol free. Oh, and she just wrote in here, she's going to look for a tracking app. That's a good idea.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure venues are going to also have different ideas and histories of how they've dealt with that. And one of the things I like to say to planners that I say a lot, if you delegate, work with your partners, communicate, don't assume you have to take it all on yourself. Ask your venue. Right. Exactly. Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Tracy. Go ahead.
Oh, no. That's okay. I mean, and I actually at one of my, I was an exhibitor at the event, exhibitor and sponsor at the event in my old corporate job. And one of our local team members came to this event and she had way too many margaritas and she fell in the fountain at the Gaylord. And I found out the next day because she didn't come registered under my group of my block.
Yeah.
So nobody knew to tell me. And
Did it hurt?
She did. She split her head open and our competitor pulled her out of the fountain. But she lost her job 2 weeks later because I'm like, I had to report it. The meeting planner is telling me the story the next day. And I'm like, please don't be my employee. Please don't be my employee. And of course she's telling me because it is one of my coworkers. Right. But yeah, I mean, so you do. And we never went, never said anything about any of that liability wise to anything, but she's probably not even going to do the same thing, but it is definitely making sure you've got those things lined up front.
It is, yeah.
That's a really good point.
Where it comes to worse and you think it's going to be a really big issue, don't offer alcohol or limit it to beer and wine or
or signature cocktail.
And always have an alternative that's not alcoholic. And one of the things I did when I was doing the police work, because I did the DUI training, and one of the things they tell you is that protein is a good way to absorb sometimes alcohol. So I'll recommend have a little bit of food if you're serving alcohol as well, because it helps process a little faster.
Right. Well, and there's so many events that I've been to that it is literally just crudité and cheese and a whole bunch of alcohol, and you really can't do this in this day and age. It's really not a way to handle an event properly. Okay, so jumping from alcohol, what about cannabis?
What about it?
The safety precautions around that. I don't know what corporate events are going to have cannabis at, or association events are going to have cannabis at their events, but that's a whole nother issue.
It is.
And I learned something. It hits you later.
So it's going to be really complicated, I think. And it's funny. I was just talking about this with my other half the other day. He's a pharmacist. And, where I live in South Carolina, there's no recreational or medical marijuana. But we had visited recently a state where it is legal both medically and recreationally. And people had said, hey, are you going to try the cannabis while you're here? And being that he's a pharmacist, he's like, no, I'm not going to do anything yet because I don't want any of my judgment or anything altered while I'm still working. So, part of me is like, hey, from an economic, financial, political perspective, I'm like, this is great. Yeah, let's have all the weed in the world. From a safety standpoint, do I want my airline pilot to be high? Do I want my bus driver to be high? Do I want my food attendants to be high? Do I want any of these people that I'm working with at trying to put on a professional event with attendees where my reputation is at stake? Do I want any of them to be influenced or under the influence of something that used to be considered an illegal drug? Right. And the answer is no. I don't want that impairment. Right. How the industry or society is going to deal with that is yet to be seen. I kind of think it might become something similar to other safety elements or other political elements where, hey, if I have my meeting here, one of my policies, one of my duty of care is there will be no guns allowed in this hotel when my group is here. And the hotel can say yes or no. Maybe it's the same thing. Well, my group is here. I don't want any venue employees using cannabis around my attendees. And maybe it's one of those negotiations. I don't think it's been written yet. I think it's yet to come.
Right. Well, and then talking on the gun one, you posted the story a couple of weeks ago how Music Midtown in Atlanta canceled the concert. And I've been going to Music. I mean, I went to Music Midtown when it first started, way back in the late 90s. And they canceled it because the park was people were allowed to carry guns in the park, but their band's riders said no guns allowed.
That's right.
And that's an interesting take. And an important thing for us to read all of our writers clearly of your speakers. And actually, that's a good thing for me to put in as a speaker, you and I both, to saying, hey, I want to make sure that there's no guns,
or I don't want you to present high.
Right.
Whether it's alcohol or marijuana or whatever.
Right.
And maybe that's going to be,
Yeah. Tyra, where's Tyra? How can we add that to our contracts? John Foster, any of them. Any of our lawyer friends.
To the question about the cannabis, I think it's going to end up being a balancing act, and it's yet to happen. Here's another prediction is that we won't deal with it until we have to. And what's going to happen is you're going to get your keynote speaker to show up, someone famous or semi-famous, and he'll be high or she'll be high or they'll be high, and everyone's going to be like, what are we going to do for the next one? So.
Right. Exactly. Well, and even the woman who, the actress that was served her papers on stage during her event, right? I mean, that wasn't food related or whatever, but somebody got on the guy delivering, you've been served papers, got on stage when she was speaking. Right. So, okay. So I want to jump back to epinephrine a little bit as well. And the medical kits. So, and this is something that I've posted recently online, and I know you're a ground safety person, but let's talk airlines real quick. Okay. My biggest thing is, what if one of your attendees that you've booked travel for or such has an emergency on an airplane, right? And the medical stuff, and they die, or they have to make an emergency landing. Who's notified, right? Somebody did comment on one of my posts that said something similar happened and they were notified because the travel agent was notified.
Okay.
About that person.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's going to depend on the situation and what's going on at that time, because, if it were me on a plane and the flight attendant was trained well enough to look on my iPhone and find my ice, then I know someone's going to be called for that. If they're not that well trained, we're just going to have to hope that there's either a doctor on board the plane who knows what they're doing, or that the pilot can land that plane fast enough to get emergency services. As far as who's going to be contacted, I think it's going to depend on the information that person has. So if I have my iPhone, they might look at that. My guess is if I'm unconscious, they're going to go through my carry-on, see what I'm carrying in there, and maybe they're going to find my conference flyer or my hotel confirmation or something and say, oh, hey, we need to call Tracy at this Marriott because this is where this person's was heading. Right. And we can let them know. But I think that's going to be, it's a hard question to answer because I think it's going to vary so much between situation and person. If I'm conscious, I might be able to mumble out who should you contact or who I want you to contact first. I remember I went into the funniest thing. A year ago, I went into the hospital with a kidney stone. I didn't know it was a kidney stone. The first thing I said to my husband was, hey, can you call so-and-so and cancel my physical therapy appointment or something mundane and not already like that. Like, should I call my mom and let her know I'm in the hospital? No, I didn't do anything like that. So, that's just where my brain went.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Oh, well, yeah, I have a story from a long time ago, but I won't tell you. So, yeah, I mean, okay. So when we're booking safety personnel to be on site, EMTs or, police or whatever, what kind of questions should we be asking them? Because you don't want to get mall cop. Oh,
no.
Sorry. What's his name? Right. You want to
Paul Blart, mall cop.
Yes, exactly. Mall cop. I mean, what questions can planners ask, when they're hiring those things to see what they've got? So and what should they be looking for? This
is something that I usually recommend when we're doing when I'm working with a group, I'm doing just site selection. I have a checklist that I use. And one of the questions I use on this checklist is, okay, great. The hotel, the venue's got great meeting space. The food and beverage is delicious and it's clean and they communicate very well. And the kitchen's been cleared by the municipality and, the guest rooms are gorgeous and clean and safe. All right, you got all that done. Now we have to make sure, does the hotel have security staff? If they do, are they trained? In what? In what and how often? Do they have a background check when they're hired? And then what is their relationship with local first responders? Because if they have that relationship, it could take that whole thing off your hands, meeting planners. And all you have to do is talk to your head of security at the hotel and say, hey, for this event, we're going to need some extra bodies. We'd like to stage an ambulance because of, I've got a large group of elderly people, or I have a large group of people with allergy sensitivities, or I have a large group of diabetics, or whatever it may be. And so you might not have to worry about it if you've got someone working on your half through the venue. Okay. The other thing I'll say is that if you are going to work with the first responders directly, like the fire department or the medical unit or the police, they're not going to say, sure, we'll send you a bunch of people. They will say something probably along the lines of, well, if you need some extra bodies to be around in case of an emergency, here's how we hire them off duty. So it would be up to the planner to say, okay, well, I would like 2 police officers to protect our exhibit hall overnight. And I would like an EMT stage because of our big dinner where we're going to have a lot of fatty foods or whatever, heart clogging foods. And then they'll help you arrange for it, but it won't be on the taxpayer. It'll be on the meeting planner to do that. But that's one of the reasons why I say, if you're working with the hotel and you're checking their security and you're asking about their background and their training and their relationship with first responders, they're probably going to have a better introduction to them than the planner would, and it'll be easier for them than the planner would. So that would be where I would direct people to go.
And what's the difference in value and by hiring a security company versus hiring an off-duty police officer?
So the off-duty police officer, one of the pros is you're helping a police officer who's probably not getting paid that much, but he'll be there in uniform. He will look like a cop like he always does. And police presence is like 90% of not having to deal with anything criminal. You see a cop standing around, you're probably not going to try to, steal something from that store or get alcohol illegally or things like that. So there's that element of it. The other thing is that with a police officer, you're only going to get them for a limited time. So maybe 8 or 10 hours at a time. So if you wanted someone to spend the night overlooking your exhibit hall, you're probably going to want to go maybe with a security firm because it'll probably be a little cheaper, but they'll be able to offer more than just 1 or 2 people to do it. And that way you don't have to worry about someone falling asleep overnight, or you don't have to worry about part of the exhibit hall not being covered while the other part is exposed or, open to theft. So those are a couple of things. Oh, the other thing about working with police department as opposed to a security department is the police department, the guy from the police department is going to have direct radio contact with fire, medic, and other police. The security firm, probably not direct, but I bet he has a pretty good contact.
Right. And hire a local one versus bringing one
exactly
from inside, outside. Yeah.
But also the other thing about, the police officer sometimes will also indicate, some people aren't comfortable seeing police officers and they think automatically something's wrong.
Right.
So there's like a little bit of anxiety. Oh, what happened in the hotel? Why is the cop here? Is it affecting our meeting? Whereas a security officer is probably going to say security, and he's not going to be loaded with a gun and all that scary equipment and things like that. So it might have a calmer environment setting to it. So those are some of the pros and cons of going one or the other. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, because you do, and it depends on who you are and who your guests are and how much money you have at the same time and how much coverage you need. Because I think it's a really good point, because you do want somebody in that exhibit hall, watching the booths, but and depending on how big your security hall is or your exhibit hall is, you might need a couple of them. Yeah.
Sometimes it even kind of matters the event itself. So when we were talking about alcohol liability earlier, if you're going to have a big loud reception or some kind of closing ceremony with a band and dancing, sometimes a uniformed police officer is that little sign to people, like maybe I need to behave a little bit more. Whereas they may not give that same courtesy to someone in a security uniform.
Right. That's very true. Okay. So I'm looking at all of our safety the questions that I had for you beforehand. Sure. And I think we've covered them all so far, but I think, it's an important thing to think about, and you actually need to, let's talk about somehow a movie theater just came into my mind, right? Okay. And now they're showing the video in front of the movie, before the movie happens to say, hey, this is the emergency exits, right? Make sure you pay attention to those. And I think that's important for you to have maybe a room monitor for general, for breakout to point out where the emergency exits are, and or put that on your event app.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's funny. One of the things I tend to do when I'm speaking on event safety is I'll get, I'm introduced or whatever, and I get up there and I'll say, just before I start, I want to point out to you, emergency exit over here, emergency exit over here. You can't see them behind me because of the pipe and drape, but there are 2 emergency exits there. Those lead to the kitchen, so you may not want to go that way. If you go out, and I'll do a really quick little evacuation spiel should there be an emergency, or should the fire alarm go off, or should you hear gunshots or whatever. Here's how you get out. I think it should be habit for all, MCs and executive directors and presidents and VIPs who are doing introductions at the beginning of a general session or the beginning of the day. Hey, folks, we want you to enjoy your conference, and we're going to start doing that in 5 seconds. But before that, if you need to get out of here really quick, here's how you do it.
Right. Okay, so that now just made me remember Jack. He was an attendee at one of my speaking sessions for North Star, and it was the Independent Planner Conference. And he jumped up in the middle of my session, and because I'm like, okay, so individuals who have wheelchairs, or individuals who utilize wheelchairs, or are visually impaired or hearing impaired, you need to make sure that you've got the steps outlined for them as well, so they understand. And he's like, oh my gosh. And he thought about somewhat like if a fire happened and one of your guests is in a wheelchair on a higher floor of a hotel, how do they get down? Right. So and what are those rooms called on floors for individuals?
I call them, most people call them handicap rooms. I call them ADA accessible rooms.
No, this was actually a room like in the stairwell. It was
you mean the refuge room where you take cover?
Yes, refuge room. Okay. Yeah. So that would be a question you could ask your properties. Do you have refuge room?
Yeah. So, I am guilty myself of not including it enough. But when I talk to people in general about safety, I always like to include that when you're planning your safety, you need to plan it for people with disabilities, because depending on the disability, they may need some assistance getting out of a building. Right. If I'm working with a hotel, technically or in theory, a certain percentage of their rooms are supposed to be ADA compliant.
Right.
And part of that's going to include safety. And then they're also supposed to have they're also supposed to be compliant with emergency evacuations for people with disabilities. And there is some training required in that, because someone in a wheelchair, for example, is not going to be able to use their wheelchair to get down. So there are safety chairs where you can put a person with a mobile person in this contraption type of thing, the chair, in this specialized chair, and help them get down the stairs during like a fire alarm. But those questions should be asked and they should be answered. And then you can decide based on the answer if it's important enough for you to hold the meeting at that venue or not. Most of this stuff, here's one of the things that a lot of planners may or may not remember. A lot of safety stuff is already done for them, because hotels are required by law. Not just hotels, a lot of suppliers we work with are required by law to have all this stuff. I was talking to a colleague not all that long ago, and the question was, how come hotels don't have the kind of same level of safety as airlines? Well, the answer is the airlines are required to. Airlines are required to have all that.
Yep.
I mean, think about it for a second. Airlines are in the business of making money and flying people and getting customers. They don't want to deal with the expense of having to deal with safety. At least they would. I don't think they would admit that. Maybe they would. I mean, I think they want us to be safe, but I don't, their goal is not necessarily to focus on that. So, you take away all the money that airlines spend on safety, and airlines are going to be a lot cheaper, a lot more competitive maybe, but they're required to have that. And hotels don't have, or a lot of venues don't have that same kind of requirement. So that's why I think some of them don't do it, because they don't have to do it.
Right. Well, and that's another question to think about too. I don't know why this just popped into my head, but I mean, I know the FAA is looking at the seat sizes because it is potentially becoming a safety issue on planes. But now I also just jumped to offsite events, right? And if you're having it under a tent and a beach on a field, what are the safety things that you need to have there? You need to actually check with the health department, right? On when it comes to the food and beverage being served.
Yeah.
Yep. And how many hand washing stations do you have? How many porta-johns do you need to have? What is the exit route or the entry?
Egress and
thank you.
Ingress and egress. And what do you do if there's a thunderstorm? And is there an alternative place to go? And what if some creepy drone shows up and is eyeing your attendees? What do you do? And
yeah. I mean, and that's, you make the assumption that that's going to get handled. And this is just a very, over the weekend or 2 days ago, somebody was telling a story of this client that they had hired her as a caterer, and they didn't want to pay the caterer for the cake. So they got their cake somewhere else, and they brought the cake, and they talked to the cake, and it was time to serve the cake. And the caterer did not have plates or silverware, flatware, or a cake knife for it, because she was never told that they were bringing a cake. But the client who was hosting the event got mad at the caterer, and the caterer's like, you didn't tell me. Right. So it's those kind of things that you actually have to think through, and it adds a lot more to that safety precaution. I mean, that's not a safety issue, but think about that safety that comes along with those things too.
Yeah. Did I answer the question about light bulb getting guests out of a hotel?
Oh, no. That wasn't a question. I posted that to Jack.
Oh, okay.
He's the guy that said that to my session. So I'm like, hey, Jack.
All that is actually, it goes with almost everything in event planning, or maybe even life. Communication is such a key thing. And not just in safety in general, but food safety is really important. Communication, not just for making sure the caterer brings, a cake knife, but making sure that there's signage at the buffet, so you know what the heck you're eating, and all that kind of stuff. And you know what they say about assuming, and it's true. You don't communicate. You just think that someone's going to take care of it. It's not going to be taken care of.
Well, and that comes down to like this one event I did for Spin years ago, and we had a woman with an apple allergy. And she had registered, she told us, and she was anaphylactic to apples. So, I mean, I sat down with the chef and we went through the menu. And then we went through the menu 2 days beforehand. And we actually changed the menu 2 days beforehand because he found it in sauces. But we put it in, we posted it on the event app. We made an announcement. The MC actually made an announcement because she could not be in the room with it. And so what is that communication that we have in doing that? We just said, you're more than welcome to eat apples outside of the meeting space.
Right.
But when you're in this space, it will be 100% apple free.
Right.
And only one person got mad at me about it.
Oh.
I'm like, she chewed me out. I'm like, okay.
I wonder why. She wanted to eat apples in the meeting?
Well, she just couldn't understand how this woman survived in society in general and went to the grocery store. And I'm like, that's not our problem. We're working on it right here. Right? Exactly.
Yeah,
okay.
no, communication it's a big one.
Mm-hmm. And use those technologies that you have, right? To do that. And communicate with your attendees as well as all your stakeholders, your suppliers, your caterers.
That's part of just a decent communication plan or a crisis communication plan, either way.
Exactly. Okay. So my final question for you, sir.
Yes.
Is what is a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience mean to you? What does that mean?
Ask me the question one more time. What is
safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience mean to you?
Can it be something that I eat at home?
It can be.
All of that stuff fits right in my kitchen. I can buy the food myself. I can make sure it's from sustainable sources. I can cook it myself, so I know that it's done properly. And then I can enjoy it myself while having an event with just me and my spouse.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm thinking more of a larger event type thing. It would be something along the lines of communicating what the meal is, making sure the meal is sourced the way that would be most appropriate for that audience, and making sure those people who are going to enjoy that meal actually enjoy the meal. Oh,
yeah, that they can enjoy the meal. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay. Any one last minute safety tip that you have for everybody?
I did have one, and
it went out of your brain.
It went out of my head, but it was a good one too. It is something along the lines of don't not include safety. Don't be afraid of safety is one. Delegate so that if you can't do it all on your own, get some help to do it. And the other one was don't be complacent, because especially it seems like in our industry we have a lot of complacency I think it's natural. We get over one catastrophe or event like 9/11. 9/11 was what prompted me to become a reserve police officer. And you remember 9/11, everything was closed for a long time, and it was just a bad thing. And we got over it. And then we had the Boston bomber, and we got over it. And now we've had COVID. I don't want us to get over it. I don't mind us working through it, but something's going to be coming. It's going to be monkeypox, or it's going to be a bad guy with a gun or a knife. And I understand we don't want to have to think about that stuff. So don't, delegate it, spread it out, but don't just ignore it.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. That's a really important message.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
You're welcome. Likewise. I appreciate it. Everybody, we're here every single Wednesday live at 12 o'clock, the Eating at a Meeting podcast. You can also download it on all your favorite podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, etc. And join the Eating at a Meeting Facebook group. It's free to join. We talk about food and beverage. How fun. What are we eating? What are we not eating? But until next week, stay safe and eat well. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.